Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today, we would like to welcome back Harley Eagle to talk to us about cultural safety in the face of this ongoing pandemic we find ourselves in. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people that I'm currently presenting on. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. So as a quick reminder to everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Specifically today, I have a feeling that we'll dive into some things that may be sensitive to some individuals. So please make sure that you're looking after yourself. For today specifically, if you need to talk to a friend, an elder, counselor, family member, whatever that support system looks like for you, I highly encourage you to engage in that. So quick introductions before we kind of launch into the meat of today. My name is Cole. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today. Other Learning Circle team members with us online, but not currently visible, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our program assistant. And for those of you on Zoom, if you feel so inclined, please introduce yourselves in the chat box, get that conversation flowing. As a brief note on chat and on questions today in particular, Harley will be doing a shorter presentation and leave longer period at the end for questions. So we're going to ask that you just kind of be patient with us. We'll hold all the questions to the end, and then we'll have a big period where we'll kind of jump into it. Okay. So with that, I think that's my whole spiel. That's all I had planned. Harley, can you take us away?
Sure. Thank you, Cole, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. And I'd like to offer mine as well. I'm happy to be sitting here in the Comox territory in Courtenay, and thank you to the people there for allowing me to be in this territory and to be with you all today from this location. I want to also acknowledge folks out there to acknowledge where you're sitting as well in whatever traditional territory you're in of the Indigenous people, and also to think about centering yourself. And I'm thinking about the elders and the wisdom keepers and knowledge keepers that encourage us to center ourselves through prayer or acknowledgement or song or drumming to start our time together that way. So just take a moment to feel yourself in your chair and the land beneath your location, and feel yourself in your spirit as well, and center yourself. Maybe take a few deep breaths if you need to, and I offer that as our acknowledgement and our connection to the spirit and to each other in this moment. Thank you for asking me to be part of this webinar today. I also want to acknowledge some people because, you know, for the whole world, really, we've had to do a massive shift. And that means so many different things to all of us. And for me, in thinking about cultural safety in this time of pandemic, the conversation really flowed from a group of people that I'm working with on a project, and the project is called Indigenous People-led Rural Continuing Professional Development Project, where we're hoping to increase the cultural safety capacity of rural doctors and their engagement with in rural Indigenous settings, and taking the lead from Indigenous people and trying to build meaningful and authentic connections with each other to deepen that understanding of what it means to be culturally safe. And so I want to just speak their names because we've done a lot of sorting through this together over the last few weeks. So I'm thankful to Elders Roberta Price and Cheryl Schweitzer. I'm thankful for Dr. Terry Aldred and Dr. Dana Hubler. And from UBC, I'd like to thank Laura Beamish and Stephanie Garasak and Ali Burrows for being a part of this project and for helping me sort through some of these notions of thinking about cultural safety in the time of pandemic. Um, I'd like to also acknowledge that this is a challenging format. You know, we're meeting over screens, and it's really right now a one-way conversation. And I much prefer if we could be together and sitting in circle, or sitting in a way where we interact in a way that we understand that we're coming from a place of mutuality, that no one is greater or less than each other, that we can hear each other's stories. And I think that's really important in this time of pandemic, that we have the opportunities to hear from each other and to hear how we're feeling. I'm really thankful for one of the elders that I mentioned, who spoke really authentically about how she's feeling in her body and in her spirit in this time of pandemic, and the worry and the difficulty in sleeping. And when we heard our elders speaking that way, it gave us permission to look within ourselves too, and to identify some of those dynamics that we're all experiencing in this difficult time of rapid change and shifting and worry and fear and all of those sorts of things. So I want to leave considerable time at the end of our session, as Cole said, so that you can maybe even speak to some of the feelings that you're experiencing in this time, you know, to acknowledge them. And that's really important, just to articulate and to be able to say what it is that you're actually feeling in this time. And there's some brain mechanics that go along with naming that feeling that you're feeling, and then your brain can respond to that feeling in a really helpful way. So it's really important, and that's why I'd like you to leave considerable time at the end for you all to maybe identify some of those things for you. And then I think there's power in all of us sharing those things together. Then again, it gives us permission to feel that and to actually do something about that in terms of well-being. And I'd also encourage you to journal. To, you know, if you don't have the opportunity to state what you're feeling, take the opportunity after this session to go for a walk and think about these things. Maybe speak with somebody in your household, or to journal about some of the things that you might be experiencing now in this time of pandemic. And just as Cole said, we recognize that this can be a difficult conversation. So I'm hoping that we do take those steps to make sure that we're looking after ourselves. So if we could have the slideshow up now, I have about 6 or 7 slides that I'd like to share with you. All right, and we can go down to the objectives, the third slide. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today, the importance of cultural safety in this time of global crisis. Um, you know, I think in working with this concept of cultural safety, and I'll explain it a little deeper in a few moments here, what cultural safety is from my perspective and from the work that from my colleagues that I work with. I think you know, it's important to kind of look at the world around you and look for those opportunities and entry points into talking about cultural safety. And I think that this current pandemic that we're living with is a important moment in cultural safety, because sometimes what we tend to do is, in times of pandemic and panic and fear, is that we forget the things that we're learning, kind of the deeper learnings, and we go back to status quo. And we'd like to say that this is actually a time for cultural safety because of the dynamics that I'll explain. So this is a time to actually delve deeper into learning about what is cultural safety and some of the teachings that come out of it. And then because we're all experiencing trauma at various levels, we'd like to talk a little bit deeper about trauma and trauma-informed practice and what that can mean for us in this time of pandemic. And then, as I mentioned, to the importance of looking around us, to the world around us, not only to the earth and to the environment, but to those other systems that are around us, and figuring out how we can actually learn from each other and see what each other is doing, so that we're not just focused on whatever particular system that you're in, whether it be health or child welfare or whatever it may be, to look to other systems as well, and find those people that are working on cultural safety within those systems to figure out how we can partner and how we can learn from one another. So I'm just going to say a little bit about myself because it informs how I talk about and think about cultural safety. I just want to say again, my name is Harley Eagle, and I'm originally from Saskatchewan in the Great Plains, and I'm Dakota on my father's side and Anishinaabe on my mother's side. And I won't go into the details of how I ended up in BC, but I did when I was about 16 years old. Was my family moved to BC, mainly because of the fallout of Indian residential schools. Both my parents are survivors, as are countless numbers of my relatives. Reserve life and all of those, that kind of chaos that kind of oppression creates in community and families and extended families. And I know that many of us have experienced that as Indigenous people. We were experiencing that, and coming to BC was an attempt to get away from the chaos for us. Very happily, I met a wonderful person when I was in my 20s, and we ended up getting married, and my partner is a social worker and very social justice orientated, and we went on and we continue on this journey of sorting through what that means to be, to consider social justice and to consider what it means to be anti-oppressive and those sorts of things. And so that led me into a journey of realizing and learning about the history of colonization, because I didn't know it. Even though my parents are survivors, even though I'm Indigenous, I wasn't taught or shown what is colonization and how has it really affected Indigenous people and all of us in society. So I went on this journey of learning about it. I lived in a place called Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and was able to work with people that were really working hard to address colonization and the continued land theft and and racism and things like that. So I started to learn about my own history in the context of colonization and from the perspective of my own people. And that led me into working on things like dismantling racism. I became a dismantling racism trainer, and that eventually expanded into other forms of oppression. And I want to say this, what's really important in that part of my journey was also being able to look at myself and starting to surface my own way of being oppressive from a sexist mentality and worldview. And I through the influence of so many profound women in my life that helped me to see my own patterns of sexism and oppression, and I will continue through the rest of my life to weed out that, because it's not a quick thing that can happen. It's a lifelong journey of trying to figure that out. But I'm so thankful that they were able to show me my own patterns of oppression, and now it's my responsibility to work on those things, not only within myself, but how can I influence the world around me and other men that I'm in contact with. And I don't say that to denigrate men or myself. In fact, what I've learned in this journey of undoing my own patterns of sexism and oppression that I fall into is that I haven't had to give anything up. My life has become so much more rich because of the authentic relationships that I able to build with so many people that influence my life in powerful ways. So I haven't had to give anything up, and I think that's one of the myths and the lies of racism, and sexism and other forms of oppression is that if we want to address those patterns that we fall into as oppressors, that we have to give things up. And in a way you do, but you gain so much more in authenticity and powerful relationships. And then it also led me into conflict resolution. I looked to something called restorative justice. That RJ there means restorative justice, and the principles and values that are built on. And really the principles and values of restorative justice come from Indigenous people from all over the world, of thinking holistically about community, about family, and the conflicts that arise. How can you deal with them in holistic and healing ways? That's what restorative justice is. For me, that lends into the concept of reconciliation as well. How can we actually heal some of these relationships that we have that are broken and not healthy at this time? How can we actually heal and look at them in a holistic way, and take responsibility for those things that we need to take responsibility for? And to move away from being thinking about justice in the terms of harshness, and rather to a way of taking responsibility for addressing harms that you may have caused, or we may have caused. And then trauma became something really important to recognize that in my own life, I carried trauma from my experiences of being raised as an Indigenous person in this world, racist things that I've experienced, also harms that I've experienced as a child, and realizing that those have had an impact on me because I didn't know that. I didn't realize the patterns that trauma instilled in me, that unresolved trauma instilled in me. So I realized very quickly that I needed to figure that out. And so it got me on this journey of looking to healing from trauma, and also looking to this concept of trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care as a helpful way of realizing the context in which trauma creates in all of us and in society, and that there's ways of actually working through that and figuring out ways forward in helpful and meaningful ways. All of those things led me to this concept of cultural safety. And because I think all of those things that I've talked about are held within cultural safety. It is about realizing the Indigenous rights of Indigenous people, and how that those rights have been stomped on and broken for centuries now. So we have to realize that and figure out, so how do we start to instill these Indigenous rights in meaningful ways from the perspective of Indigenous people. It is about addressing systemic racism and other forms of oppression. And it's about doing that in a way that's embraces values that can heal and that can repair and restore relationships. And I know that sounds that in some ways that can sound a little bit perhaps touchy-feely, but in my opinion, if we really own up to the history of colonization and the harms created, it's actually probably one of the most difficult things that we can do is to face that. But understanding that it's trauma has happened over these years, and trauma is very prevalent in our society. I think that all of those elements are embedded within cultural safety. So the last thing I'll say about this is that, and it goes back to this process that we're all struggling with in terms of being doing this kind of work through the internet and doing it virtually. I really believe strongly in the circle process, and one of the reasons why is because of our ability then to be vulnerable with one another and to practice vulnerability. And when I say that word vulnerability, I don't mean it as a meek and mild way of being. I mean it as a strength. because I believe if we can practice vulnerability with each other, that actually increases our connections and our strengthens our relationship with one another, and realizing that we actually need each other to be on this journey of reconciliation or whatever it may be. And that to me is strength. And that comes from, I believe, an Indigenous worldview about the connection of all things. And so that's what vulnerability looks to and realizes, that we actually do need each other. And that to me is speaking to strength, not to any form of weakness. So we can go to the next slide now. Cultural safety in this time of global crisis. Um, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we realized that now is actually the time for cultural safety, because we saw all these reactions to the pandemic, and rightly so. You know, all of these efforts that everybody is making, from government to systems to individuals to families. These are good things. However, if you don't take them in, if you don't take the context into consideration, then you run the risk of not being culturally safe, especially for Indigenous people. If you don't understand some of the dynamics that have happened, and the things that have happened to Indigenous people and continue to happen, then you run the risk of creating more harm. So that's why some of our efforts have shifted to bring these concepts into consciousness, and this history and in these current realities into the consciousness of healthcare providers, or whoever it is that may be responding to communities in different ways now because of this pandemic. It's so important to recognize and to know and to realize that this history and the current realities that exist for Indigenous people, so that you can work in ways that are culturally safe. We also recognize that the challenges in doing that is that the world over has had to respond really quickly, and again, rightly so. But it's often coming from this place of responding really quickly. Perhaps there's some fear and pandemic or panic, and maybe again, rightly so. But it's a stressful situation, and when we do that, we tend to forget some of the new learnings, and we respond, or we work in ways that are solely based on survival, which again is important to do these things thinking about survival. But how can we add the dynamic of thinking through this carefully, so that we don't create more harm in the ways that we're reacting and interacting? And now oftentimes, again, we operate from a triggered place. So it's important to understand those kinds of dynamics, and that's what trauma-informed practice can help us with, is to understand triggers and understand how our body is responding, and how others may be responding as well, and what can we do to mitigate and to work through that, and maybe even embrace those sorts of notions, and not just push them aside, or try to power through them or over them. So if we could go to the next slide, I just want to explain really quickly for those of you that perhaps are new to this concept of cultural safety. I won't go into a lot of detail about it. In fact, I'll work from an assumption that many of you have an understanding of cultural safety, and perhaps many of you are quite steeped in working with this concept of cultural safety. But I want to just explain how just a quick definition of cultural safety. So this first point here, cultural safety, it's an aspiration. It's something that we're hoping to head towards. We're heading toward it, and we're hoping that one day we can create the dynamics that can actually make this happen. And I'll say that we're a long way off from this. We're trying. Many different groups of people are trying to create this kind of setting. Some are almost there perhaps, but others are just scratching the surface of what it means to create an environment that is spiritually, socially, and emotionally safe, as well as physically safe for people, where there's no assault or challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. And it's about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, and experience of learning together. There are several definitions of cultural safety out there, and in my work I actually look to several of them. One of the ones that I often use comes from the First Nations Health Authority, and I really want to thank them for their efforts and work on cultural safety. Um, and the emerging concept that comes from First Nations Health Authority, the concept of cultural humility, is the process. So how do we get to a cultural safety setting that I just talked about? It's through this concept of cultural humility. And this is how we can work at a process that is based in self-reflection, of looking inward, to surfacing your own bias, your own behaviors, and your own attitudes, recognizing their connection to the systemic nature of oppression that create these biases and these attitudes within ourselves, and to develop and maintain respectful processes. So that means doing things differently. I really appreciate the quote from Einstein that says we can't use the same thinking that got us into the problem to get us out of the problem. So we do have to look to different ways of doing things. And the wonderful thing about Indigenous cultural safety is that you can look to Indigenous people and to Indigenous processes, people that have been doing things a certain way for a lot of years, built on respect and built on connection. We can look to the genius and brilliance of Indigenous peoples to create different kinds of processes that are based in relationship and respect and mutuality and authenticity. And it involves realizing and recognizing that there's so much that we don't know. There's so much that has been covered up for us, and we have to be on this journey of peeling back those layers and learning these things that have happened in history and that continue to happen, and how we connect with all of that. So learning about yourself as well becomes really important within the concept of cultural humility. So again, thank you to First Nations Health Authority for their work on cultural safety, and that we can look to their resources to help guide us in doing this kind of work. The next slide, please. So I just want to talk now about trauma-informed care. And again, really quickly, you can spend weeks and months on learning about trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care. I just want to raise up a couple of the principles that I have found helpful, and then I want to also speak to a document that I found just at the start of the physical distancing criteria that we're all, and the restrictions that we're all living with now, that I found really helpful. So we want to say, one of the, I think, most important principles of trauma-informed practice and care is the recognition that that trauma is all around us, that people are living with unresolved trauma. It's so prevalent in our society, and there's a lot of studies that show just how prevalent various forms of childhood trauma, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and even epigenetical trauma that we're all living with. And then trauma-informed practice also informs us that you don't necessarily need to know the details of an individual's traumatic experience. It's just recognizing that they're living with unresolved trauma. So we don't need to know the details, but we do need to understand that things have happened. And this particular workshop is speaking to some of those things that Indigenous people have had happened to us, and that continue to happen. So we want to bring those kinds of experiences into consciousness, not so much at an individual level, but at a society level, at a people level, so that people know that this is what has happened and continues to happen to Indigenous people. And so I want to just say that there's an online PDF that I found really helpful. It's called COVID-19 Considerations for a Trauma-Informed Response for Work Settings, Organizations, Schools, and Clinics. And it comes out of an organization called Trauma Informed Oregon, and it's based at the Portland State University. I reached out to them to ask if I could use their document and to express my appreciation for it, and they were more than happy to collaborate. They said this collaboration is really important at this time, so they were happy to be collaborative in this. And so encourage you to take a look at that document and download it. There's some really helpful things, and then add to it in terms of your particular setting, those things that are important to you and your work. You can actually add to it. So if we could have the next document now, or sorry, the next slide now. So trauma-informed practices during this crisis. So again, looking to this document, these are some of the things that we can take into mind when we're working in our settings. And I did forget to say something at the very beginning of this session. I wanted to thank all of the people that are considered frontline workers now, whether it's in healthcare or in retail or what have you. There's so many different people that are now in some ways raised to the level of frontline workers in all of this, and so I want to thank them and recognize that they're putting themselves in harm's way for the good of society. So I want to thank them for that. And I wanted to say that because that's the way I'm thinking about trauma-informed practices. You know, how can you, in some of these settings, and it doesn't have to be in physical settings either, where you are still interacting with others in hospitals or healthcare settings or stores or what have you. This can also happen online too, when you're connecting with your colleagues online. It's important to remember to support and model, and some people call it co-regulation, to recognize the importance of taking the time to breathe and to ground yourself. This is highly triggering and a highly stressful time for all of us in a myriad of ways. So it's important to take the time to be with each other, where we can take the time to breathe and take the time to ground ourselves, and even to name some of those feelings that we're experiencing, to do that together. And modeling calm behavior is really about mirroring. It's about, you know, if there's this concept that if you can mirror or show a calm, that you're calm, that others will regulate themselves to your calmness as well. So it's important to take the time to center yourself and try to be as calm as you can. And being calm doesn't mean ignoring the issue. It in fact, it means embracing the issue in helpful and healthy ways. And so relational practice becomes really important in all of this. And relational practice doesn't mean that we have to be, you know, in physical proximity with one another. We can practice relational ways of being in a virtual setting or on the telephone. We can be mindful of what it means to set a good tone, a healthy tone, to take the time to listen carefully to one another, and provide space for one another to speak what they're going through, what they're dealing with, and what's working for them, and what they're frustrated with. So taking those times, that time to be in healthy relational practice with one another, it helps to reduce stress. As I mentioned earlier, when our elder spoke to her own feelings, you know, in an authentic way, it gave us the permission, the rest of us permission, to also speak to that, and it actually helped to reduce our stress. And I found myself talking to my family about it and naming the stress that I was feeling in this time of pandemic, and it spread from there. So being upfront, being authentic about what you're going through and speaking about it, really it helps to reduce stress, create calmness, and it can spread as you share it with others as well. It's also important to explain and why and what to expect. You know, when we're in our survival brain, when we're stressed or triggered, we go to this place of survival brain. We actually want to know what is happening. We want to understand, and we actually want things to be almost black and white. And that's a survival response. You know, either I need to run, either I need to shrink, or either I need to fight. You know, it's that kind of fight, flight, freeze. And I know there's more understandings around fight, flight, and freeze as well. So it's important to be transparent and to explain why it is that you're doing things a certain way, and what's the meaning behind doing things a certain way. And that, again, that helps to provide some stress reduction, because then people have an understanding of where you're coming from, why you're doing things in a certain way, and it doesn't add to the chaos of this time when we don't know a lot of what's going on in the world around us and we don't know what to expect. So if we can provide a measure of transparency in this time, that really helps to reduce the stress. And that holds true too for those of you out there that are working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous settings, to take the time to explain, where you're coming from in all of this and why you're doing the things that you're doing, and then taking the time to listen, to see how is this landing for people. Are there other things that we need to take into consideration that come from the perspective of Indigenous people and communities? It's also important to remember that we're going to be in times of being triggered and stress, and our bodies deal with those things, and our emotions deal with those things in different ways. So it's important. So we might experience some behaviors that are troubling. There might be problems for people to deal with. They might be more impulsive and act out of a strong emotion that they might be feeling in that moment. They might actually act out of that. And it's important to remember that we're living in very stressful times. We're asking so much of ourselves and our communities to respond and to be in different ways, and that's very stressful. So it's important to remember that we're often acting out of that place of stress and triggering. So really, we're talking about safety in all of this. How do we create and set a tone for feeling safe in all of this, and having some understanding, and to reduce the chaos that we're surrounded with in this time. But now I want to talk a little bit, and we can go to the next slide now. I want to talk a little bit about some of these, the history, this historic and the current issues, to bring into consciousness, to remember that Indigenous people have faced for centuries now. And a lot of our traumatic history is focused on epidemics, wave after wave of new unheard of diseases that came, in the last 500 years when contact first happened in North America. Of these epidemics, these diseases that we had no way of fighting, that we had no natural immunity and antibodies to deal with these epidemics. So they were vastly devastating. It's really difficult to express in words just how devastating. Some data says that up to 90% of the population of Indigenous people of the Americas was lost mostly due to epidemics. There were other factors as well, but these epidemics were so devastating. And not only in the sheer loss of life, but also in the loss of the ability to mourn when you're dealing with so much death. And we're seeing this in the news too, where it's folks aren't able to grieve in appropriate ways, and that happened to Indigenous people as well. And for a lot of Indigenous peoples, the process of mourning was very holistic and often very long. So a year-long process, sometimes up to 4 years of mourning the loss of a loved one. And so when you're not able to do that as something that's so important to you in your culture, it has a devastating effect on your mental health and your well-being, your spiritual well-being and emotional well-being. So that's what Indigenous people were dealing with, wave after wave of epidemics throughout the last few hundred years. And then further to that, you're also losing knowledge keepers, and you're losing, in those loved ones that you're losing. You're losing wisdom, you're losing healers, you're losing protectors, you're losing people that can feed your community. So it creates all of these dynamics that are so overwhelming and so traumatic. And Indigenous people have faced wave after wave of that over the years. And so we still carry that historical trauma within us in the face of epidemics. And so those can be triggering events, you know, when we're using the words epidemics and pandemic for a lot of Indigenous people. And we might not even understand it, but at a epigenetical level and at an intergenerational historical level, we might be feeling a heightened sense of fear and panic because of this long history of epidemics in our communities. And then it just kind of grew from there with these epidemics. And if we think about residential schools, a lot of us know a lot more nowadays through the TRC about Indian residential schools, and we know that disease played a big role in the loss of young people's lives within those residential schools. So again, there's this fear of disease that we'll have that will carry through the generations that we experience in residential schools. And then further to that are the Indian hospitals. And the Indian hospitals, the concept itself came out of the fear that from mainstream society that Indigenous people were carriers of disease. So then you start to throw in racist mentality and looking at Indigenous people as inferior and adding that to the epidemics that we were facing, then creates this fear. So we start to see through the history of chronic disease like tuberculosis increasing in our communities, not because we were not only because we were susceptible to it, but because of the circumstances in which we lived in. So the history of oppression and the forced removal from traditional territory and the changes in the way we lived our lives and the lack of infrastructure that for healthy homes just created these dynamics where things like tuberculosis were deadly occurrences in our communities. But the community didn't, or the larger community, mainstream society didn't see all of those dynamics or didn't look at all of those dynamics that created those situations in Indigenous communities. They only saw us as Indigenous people as dirty and carriers of disease. So they created this concept of, or this structure, the system of Indian hospitals that came about after the Second World War because of the fear of that Indigenous peoples were carriers of tuberculosis and that they should not mingle and mix in mainstream hospitals. And so we saw the rise of this whole system of Indian hospitals after the Second World War. And again, so then, you know, terrible things happen, just like in residential schools. That I won't go into some of those details, but if you want to look into that history, you'll learn a lot about the mentality and the way that Indigenous people were seen as less than, as inferior, as a group of, or a setting where experiments could be done in both in residential schools and Indian hospitals. And so we carry that legacy with us, the fear and that unresolved trauma that carries forward. And then a lot of terrible things happened too during that time, when we were devastated by epidemics, when we were in disarray because of Indian residential schools and Indian hospitals. Several governments saw this as an opportunity for the continued taking of our land, for behind closed doors making decisions for us. And of course, structures like the Indian Act were put in place that took away our control. To this day, and so terrible things happened while we were dealing with and living with epidemics and all of the chaos that comes out of that, like residential schools and Indian hospitals as well. And so decisions were made and things were done to us and to our land during those times. So you might experience that or see that within Indigenous communities now, where there's this lack of trust. Like, okay, so what's going to happen? You know, while we're dealing with this pandemic, what kind of decisions are going to be made about our land and about us during that time. That's that legacy of distrust that came about from decisions made by government over the years when we were in disarray. And then, just adding to all of this, then the impact of colonial infrastructures on the lives of Indigenous people and the challenges it created. I mentioned a few of them already, with overcrowded homes in a lot of reserves in Indigenous communities, the lack of access to things like healthcare and other things that sometimes we consider normal in mainstream society. For many Indigenous communities in many different settings, the infrastructures aren't there, or are poor infrastructures. So all of those things have impacts. It creates poverty. It creates homes that are overcrowded. It creates access to the lack of access to clean water, to sewer, to electricity in some cases. So all of those are connected to the colonial infrastructures that are still in existence in many of our communities throughout Canada. And then another issue to keep in mind, to bring to consciousness, is our value in our communities of the high regard that we pay to the elderly people, to our elders, to the senior population. And because this particular epidemic is devastating to the senior population, our fear and our risk and we're going to be especially worried because of who elders are to us in our communities, for the wisdom that they carry, and for our fear of the loss of that wisdom, for their grounding, and for how they ground us spiritually and provide direction for our community. There's going to be an escalated worry and concern for our elders. And then remote communities and different worldviews. I'm working with one particular company that works in the far north of Canada. And oftentimes what they talk about from the perspective of people that are working in small communities and the Indigenous communities in the far north, is they talk about the Southern mentality, or the Southern worldview, compared to the Northern worldview. And you see it in remote communities as well, like even on Vancouver Island and throughout BC, where they're used to this decisions that are often made in places like Victoria or in big centers, without taking into consideration how things are different in northern and remote communities. So you often end up with an us and them mentality and understanding. And again, the lack of trust and respect for Southern or big city folks, because of the lack of understanding of what life is like in remote communities and rural communities. And then to top it all off, I just want to say a few words about systemic racism. I think you could put all of these things that I've just talked about into this concept of systemic racism, where some folks feel superior and that they can make decisions for what they would consider inferior people. And so structures are created out of that. And we still see that to this day with things like the Indian Act and how decisions are made based on who has the power. And for most Indigenous communities and people, they don't hold the power to be able to make decisions that are meaningful for them. And then there's also the systemic racism that includes the attitudes and the behaviors and the bias that's held for Indigenous people or towards Indigenous people. So a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with an Indigenous friend, and we were talking about how difficult it is for us to go into stores during this time, because we feel like people are looking at us and watching us because of that legacy of the narrative of the dirty Indian or the Indigenous person that carries disease. We felt that. And so that's that epigenetical and intergenerational trauma that we feel, and also the racism the narratives that go along with racism, systemic racism, that informs people that this still is so. You know, that there was a reason why Indian hospitals were created, and that narrative in a lot of ways still remains to this day. And we're also seeing it play out in how folks of Asian descent are considered to be the ones that brought this epidemic to the world. And so we're seeing incidences of increased racism towards folks of Asian descent. So let's go on to the next slide. And again, I want to make sure that I leave time for questions and thoughts and comments. And I know that I'm moving fairly quickly through this, but again, one of my colleagues used the phrase "bringing into consciousness" some of these dynamics, and that's what we're trying to do here, is just to bring some of these things into consciousness, and you can go on to this journey of digging deeper into this, of looking to different organizations like the First Nations Health Authority. On their website, they talk a lot about the history of epidemics and Indian hospitals and residential schools, so you can learn more about this, and then there's references within that as well. So you can go on this journey of peeling back the layers and discovering what has actually happened from the perspective of Indigenous people. I just want to say a few words about thinking beyond cultural safety in healthcare, or in your particular setting, whatever area that you're working with in society, whether it's child welfare or retail or justice system or what have you, or social workers, to thinking beyond that. I think now is the time for us to be creative and to be collaborative. In fact, that's one of the ways, that's a trauma-informed practice way as well, or principle, is to be collaborative, you know, to look to see what supports and resources are around you, how can you gain from them, and then how can you help others too? How can you work with others and provide things that you could provide to others? So I think we have to get beyond thinking of our siloed way of working, and keeping other systems in mind. There's this wonderful concept within trauma-informed practice that I really like, and so they'll say, for some folks that are talking about trauma-informed practice, they'll say, so we work in silos, but rather than building bridges between the silos, we have to figure out how to blur the lines. And so I like that. So it's actually speaking in a way that we start to collapse the walls that have kept us working in silos. How do we blur those lines, and how do we start not just having a bridge, but seeing how our work intersects, and then how can we support in those intersections, and learn from each other, and realize that, you know, our particular setting, if it's healthcare, it has impacts on other settings as well. So how can we be aware of that, and how can we work in a way that keeps these other systems in mind when we're making our decisions of how to address this pandemic? So initiating new partnerships and thinking creatively and collaboratively in this time of crisis, and learning from our steps and learning from each other. You know, I think in terms of being creative and working in this complexity of chaos right now, is I think if we can be okay with not being okay with realizing we're not going to have it all figured out up front, but how can we try things, and then how can we reflect on what we tried, and kind of examine, how is this working? You know, how can we be iterative in our response, where we're trying creative things, seeing how it goes, and if it's a good thing, we can continue, but if it needs some changes, then we can step back and make some changes and try again. I think we have to be okay with that, and not having the perfect process in place right up front. Let's try some creative things. Let's be collaborative, and let's learn from each other, learn from our mistakes, and then how do we support each other in this continued journey? So I want to just, that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm glad that we still have considerable time for questions and answers and comments. So I'll look to Cole to facilitate that. But I just want to encourage you to, as I said at the beginning, to think about how your body, how your emotions, how your spirit is reacting in this time of pandemic, and to be upfront with it, to articulate that, because we're all feeling this upheaval in our lives, and we're all experiencing it in different ways. And it's important to recognize that, and it's important to name it, and then it's important to support each other in healthy responses. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Harley. That was fantastic. I found myself kind of at times very deeply pensive in thought as to what you were saying. So I have a couple questions of my own that we can run by, and I'll wait for the chat box to kind of populate. If you have any questions or just general comments, things you think might stimulate conversation, please leave them in the chat box, or you can send them to us directly through the Q&A section if you'd prefer to go that way. So one of my first questions, Harley, is we talked a lot about, you talked a lot about how we can communicate the intention of maintaining cultural safety. And I say maintaining in the hope that, you know, the most of the people that are here that are engaged in this conversation are aware of kind of the work that's been going on and are engaging in that process. How can we communicate ahead of time, so before we get an individual into an appointment or into a meeting or into, you know, whatever the setting is that we're talking about here, that it is our intention to move forward and maintain cultural safety despite the heightened stress, despite everything that's going on around us? Because we talked a little bit about it, and it seems critical, because I know, like, you know, my aunties, they might not even go into the room with let's say a doctor's appointment, right? They might not even show up. So how do we communicate that ahead of time? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the first word that came to my head when you were asking that question is to practice. To reach out to, before you go into the settings, to reach out to your colleagues, your friends, you know, others that you know are working with this kind of understanding, and to try these things on first, you know, to say, so what do you think of this? I'm thinking about doing it this way. What am I missing? You know, what's your reaction to that? Or who else can I talk to? Who could provide me some insight into this approach? So that's what I would say, is to I think we have to be connecting more, and being transparent, and being okay with somebody saying, yeah, I don't think that's going to work. You know, here's why. You know, if we can all explain kind of why, not just shut somebody down, and be open to that kind of criticism and critique, so that we can make that interaction, you know, as best as possible, as culturally as safe as possible. Something that I've learned from doing restorative justice work, and bringing people together when they're in conflict, whether it's in circle or whether it's in a mediation, or just speaking with somebody individually, is that a lot of pre-work needs to happen. I like to say that 80% of dealing with conflict is pre-work as a facilitator. You know, what do you need to learn about, and who can you talk to beforehand? How can you prepare people before you bring them together if they've been in conflict? So talking with them individually, you know, hearing their story, so they can practice as well, you know, what that setting is going to be like for them. So much pre-work needs to happen before you actually bring people together. And I think that that's what needs to happen within cultural safety as well, is that we have to be on this journey of learning from one another and practicing before we actually enter into settings where if we haven't done that kind of pre-work, then we run the risk of being culturally unsafe and damaging relationships.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think generally speaking, yeah, I saw it was in the chat. Sally said that practice makes perfect, and I think as long as we can find the safe ways to practice, then absolutely, for sure. So we have our first question from a circle member here, and it's kind of related to my previous question, but they ask, how do we share how do we share meaningful messages about cultural safety in times of social distancing? And I think, if I may take it, please correct me in the chat box if I'm mistaken. If I may take it a step further, I think how do we share these? Because we talked a little bit at the beginning about the imperfections of the format that we're using right now, in the sense that it is very one or two-way communication at best, right? Zoom can't handle 300 people all talking at the same time. So what would be kind of my step forward would be, what do you think is a better or an ideal way to go about having these kind of collaborative conversations, setting that space to have that kind of safely?
Mm-hmm.
And then additionally, so then within that place, we could share meaningful messages about cultural safety. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. A couple things too that come up for me. I want to recognize a colleague of mine, Christiane Perez, who asked a question last week of me. She said, "How do we create culturally safe virtual settings?"
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to all of you out there, I think if we can think about that too, how do we do things in such a way virtually that take into consideration culturally safe practices? Yeah, so and I don't have the answer for that, but it's something that I'm putting out to my colleagues and my friends. Let's start thinking about that, because I think that's going to be really important in the virtual setting. Further to that, I think if we start reaching out to other organizations, we will see some really creative ways that people are embracing. I know that there's some elders that are doing some wonderful work, like recording some videos of prayers, of songs, to encourage people. I think people are finding those creative ways, and I don't want to name just a few, because I think the process of finding those becomes really important, because as you do that process of reaching out, you begin to build relationship, and you begin to blur the lines, like I was mentioning earlier, between our silos. Yeah, I think it becomes an encouraging thing too, when we see these wonderful and creative ways. Then we can thank people for it, lift them up, acknowledge them, and I think it creates that reciprocity practice as well. It's so important in relationship building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm seeing from the chat box a lot of different kind of mixed review of Zoom and of other things. I think we're all kind of in that space of kind of trying to step out and find what works best for us and for our communities and for our families, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have an influx of questions. So I'm just going to start trying to
Okay.
motor through them as quick as I can. Um, Ria asks, the health and education organizations I work for are working on developing creative and collaborative ways for therapists to provide services to families at home via Zoom, which is,
Mm-hmm.
we see that a lot, right? Two questions about that. Number one, if a family invites me, so in this case, Ria is a non-community member, into their home in this way, what factors should I keep in mind to provide a culturally safe experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we have to take into consideration what's our responsibility in this time of pandemic. What are we all being called on in the society to do, as far as practicing good physical distancing practices, and to know that it's not just about our interaction in a culturally safe way with that family, but it's also about our responsibility to our own families and to society around us. So I would say, kind of looking to the physical aspect of it. What do I need to understand about the physicality of it? Is this okay to do? Who can I check with? In from a healthcare perspective, perhaps. How do I look at this from an emotional way as well? Like, is this way of being? Is this conducive to good emotional connection? Asking those questions, and then taking into consideration the history, perhaps, of this family. Are they Indigenous? What kind of trauma might they be experiencing? What, you know, is the offer, and is this coming from a place of unresolved trauma? So taking into consideration trauma-informed practice in all of this. And then I think also looking at the spiritual dynamics of this, you know, and taking those all into consideration. I think if you think about it kind of holistically, ask questions of others that can help you understand this, then that will provide a way forward that you can, you know, come from a well-informed way. Is this appropriate to do? And then if you're feeling that it's not, then explore other options to not just say no, but to say maybe we can do it this way, you know, rather than just a flat out no. Let's explore a creative way that's meaningful and safe for all of us to interact. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, so Ria has an additional follow-up question, and this one's a little bit more kind of open-ended, I think. But what are your thoughts about inequitable service provision during this time? And what they mean is some families, for many different reasons, are not able to access these services. So I'm thinking specifically like the Zoom, you know, services over Zoom. Is it okay or fair to provide services to those families who are able? And I think we're seeing this kind of question come up a lot across a lot of different sectors, right? Like in education, for example, with the shift to online classes, you know, if you're in a multi-child family and you only have one laptop, who gets to attend class? Do you know what I mean? Over online spaces. So I think it's a valid thing that we need to be really critical of as professionals working in a variety of contexts. What are your thoughts on it, Harley?
Yeah, I just want to say to Cole that you were breaking up a bit there. I think I caught the question. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. So I think rather than providing, you know, from my perspective, I think what would be most helpful for me to not provide a way forward, because frankly, I'm not quite sure. Like I would have to go into a process of asking and discovering. But I think what we can learn from this and from this question is that this will point out inequities, right? This whole process, because just as you said, some folks it'll be fairly easy for them to shift into a new way of doing, because they have the resources, they have the ability, they have the experience, and so many people don't. And so I think that we have to be mindful of that this will point out a lot of the inequities within our systems and the way that we do things, and the way that we consider normal. You know, because for a lot of us, this can be considered normal, but for so many people, this would be considered really strange. And yet, if we don't understand that, we're going to just go forward with this, what we consider as normal, and we're going to lose people along the way. So being mindful of those kind of dynamics, and we might not have the answers right now, but let's figure it out, you know, together, and let's figure out how we can bring those voices in that don't have the ability to and the access. You know, one of the concepts within the principles within systemic racism is this concept they call access to excess. And I think you know, if we work from an analysis of systemic oppression and racism, we'll start to realize, you know, just how much some of us have access to so much, you know, and again, it's almost considered normal. And so I think if we pay attention to those people that don't have the access, it'll point us in the direction of asking the question, so why is that? And it's not necessarily that we have to pull people up to this, to you know, what we have. It's about recognizing that the inequities in the systems that we currently have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's almost, through the lens of this current situation, it's almost like a crucible with which we can gauge where we, like, as a society, as a greater community, where we're failing individuals, I think, where we're not meeting what I would consider to be the standard for care for everyone, kind of across the board, in education, health, whatever context it is you're talking about. You know what I mean? So thank you for that. So this is an interesting question from an anonymous attendee that I think we've chatted about a couple times in the past. How do I engage or inform upper management at my organization to consider these ideas that you've mentioned in this presentation in their work with Indigenous individuals, communities, I assume Indigenous individuals at their own staff? What are your thoughts on that, particularly in the light of kind of all the work that's being done from home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's probably one that we've struggled with and been challenged with, throughout the history of trying to address oppression. So what I want to say is that I think what's really important in cultural safety work is understanding the dynamics of oppression, like racism. So if you can work from an analysis of racism, then it also provides you ways forward in addressing some of these dynamics. So what I'm hearing, and I could be wrong about this, what I'm hearing from the question is that that perhaps there's a frustration, and that perhaps the system or the organization that they're talking about is highly bureaucratic. And that bureaucracy comes out of, in my opinion, a system of oppression, like racism and colonialism and all that, where there's a hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to get your opinions, your thoughts, your ideas of ways forward upwards, because everything flows down, from the few at the top. They're telling you what to do. So you're actually saying, so how do I reverse that? Which is really hard. So what we have found, some of the strategies is bringing into consciousness some of these dynamics, like getting people in a setting where a good tone is setting, where their ears are open, where they're not at a place of defensiveness because you're accusing them, because if you accuse somebody, they go defensive, right? And they shut down, like literally their audio system doesn't hear what you have to say because they're in fight, flight, or freeze. So how do you create a setting where they can actually hear you? And some of those ways is through creating a dynamic, like we have found. The blanket exercise is a really good place where people become open, because they share an experience together where they can see the history of what's happened to Indigenous people and the current realities. So they become open, their hearts become open. So then they're able to hear. So and there's also another dynamic that could be used is finding an ally within the structure that you're trying to speak to. So finding somebody that actually will listen to you, and then encourage their responsibility to talk with their peers. So those are just a couple different strategies. But the last thing I'll say is that I believe that the relational practice becomes really important in all of this, so that people don't shut down. Because if you enter into conversations like this, where you trigger somebody and they shut down and they're not hearing you, what can actually happen is that person becomes even further entrenched in their ideology and their perspective. Right. And so I think that's what's been happening so much in society, is that we're polarized, and we speak to each other from those polarized places, and we lob, bombs at each other, and all we're doing is creating further entrenchment into those ideals. So how do we come together in authentic ways? And I want to stress that I'm not talking about, again, I'll use the term touchy-feely. I'm talking about, how do you create a setting where people can actually have frank conversations, where they can face and look at a difficult history and difficult current realities in a way that they're open and that they can absorb it. And it can often transform people's lives, because they enter into that journey of discovery and learning and finding themselves in that structure as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, crossing those lines. I love that analogy you made, crossing those lines in an authentic way. I think that's It's really important, and it's, I think, also important to note that it's going to look different for every field, every team, every individual, right? So how do we kind of do that? So we have another question. I think it's quite a bit more, a little bit more personal. So I'm struggling with bias, and with my bias or attitude. It stems from the observation, I assume they're kind of perceived observations of the general population finally understanding what Indigenous people have been through, now having going through a pandemic themselves, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as we talked about, Indigenous people have been through this in our families historically. I struggle with this because I don't want to feel this way, as if like I'm taking some liberty here, but as if they're almost or that it pleases them that somebody can understand their pain by experiencing the pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I struggle with this because I don't want to feel this way. Any thoughts or guidance?
Right. Well, again, looking to a anti-racism strategy or analysis, and then how you can actually start to address this. One of the tools that we encourage is what we call caucusing. So it's racialized people or Indigenous people will go off and do some work around how they've internalized or how we've internalized racism, how it's affecting us. And then we encourage folks that are racialized as white to do the same thing. And that's where you can do some of that deep work around naming the feeling in a setting where it can be held, and you're not saying it in the presence of Indigenous people, and maybe creating some further harm, or maybe that dynamic isn't conducive to a healthy relationship. But when you're working with other folks that are racialized the same as you, and that have carry the same feelings, or that maybe have worked through some of those feelings, they can offer you support and understanding and some ideas of what it means. Because I think the important piece in all of this is the phrase, I don't want to have this feeling, but you do have the feeling, right? And so it's important to name that, to embrace it, and to figure out what to do about it in an appropriate way. And that's why caucusing becomes really important, because folks that are racialized, that have a similar racialization as you, can help you and support you, and you can work at that together in a safe setting where you're safe, and it's not creating damage for other folks that have different dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Harley. Yeah, yeah. We have a thank you from the person that asked the question in the panel. So switching gears a little bit here, Sally's asking if you know of any or resources that you would recommend for working with people regarding cultural safety and humility within the education system. So they highlight elementary and high school and university. I know, if I may briefly here, Harley, university, the kind of there are programs that exist there are programs, there are curricula that exist depending on kind of where you sit in the institution. So ourselves, we have 23 UBC 2324 that works at kind of educating healthcare professional or prospective healthcare professionals before they head out into their career. But is there anything you can think of for kind of engaging, particularly like elementary school and high school students, resources that you might recommend?
Well, first thing I'd like to say is thank you, Cole, for offering what you have, and I encourage other folks out there, if you have ideas, to share them as well. I think what comes to mind for me is the blanket exercise through Kairos. They have a version that's designed for young folks, for elementary school age children. So I would encourage looking to that organization, Kairos Canada, and they can help you find facilitators to do that in schools. As well as they would have a list of resources as well that could further that journey. But I'd like to hear others too, if they have ideas for resources for younger age children.
Yeah, we'll try and gather some of that stuff, and I'll highlight it if we see it in the chat box. I just wanted to take this moment as well to remind everybody that anything that we talk about, the Learning Circle team is kind of doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that we get as many of those resources as possible. So the blanket exercise, as an example, is definitely something that we'll share. You'll get an email afterwards that'll have kind of a lot of the things that we talked about in a link, so that you can access it, and get it that way. Just so, because there's quite a few people that are asking, how do you spell that, etc. So it'll come as soon as we're finished here. Okay, so this next question is a bit of a longer one. Susie says, I really like the acknowledgement of differing worldviews within Indigenous communities and urban areas. The impact of worldview deeply affects so much of life, and it really is foundational to why and how we do things, and more importantly, how to think and do differently in a culturally safe way that will help healing. The impact of colonialism on our ways of being and doing is directly related to identity and well-being, often a clash of worldview happening within individuals that leads to conflict. And I know, based on our previous conversation, Harley, that we've chatted a lot about worldview and contrasting worldviews. I don't want to say worldviews in conflict, but contrasting, let's say. So do you think that in light of this, do society/institutions need to acknowledge the value of Indigenous worldview and make space for it? I think the nature of the conversation is there more work that needs to be done? Do you know what I mean? Can we take this work forward further?
Yeah. Ooh, I like that question because I think it's very it's a deep question. There's a lot underneath that I think needs to be said. Um, and let's see if I can get there fairly quickly of kind of the end point that I want to get to. Because somebody else talked about it too. I think it was around the question of the feeling that they're feeling around that they don't want to feel around the history of epidemics for Indigenous people. If you go even further back with the history of epidemics that came to Turtle Island, to North America, there's a history of how those epidemics came about and how devastating they were to folks of European and other parts of the world previous to 500 years ago. And they were, millions of people died with those epidemics, but then that resistance was built up over a few hundred years. And so that's how it came here. So my point is that when we do cultural safety work, we often talk about what we call the older story of colonization, where we take a look back to Europe and look at the history of what happened to the indigenous people of Europe, to come to the point of realizing that the colonized of Europe became the colonizer that we know today. And we also like to point out things like that. So how did this become institutionalized? So we start talking about the ideology of things like racism, but we also talk about structures that are still with us today, like this thing, I don't know if folks have heard of the doctrine of discovery. But basically it's the legal and moral apparatus that has allowed for modern day colonization. So it's this policy, if you will, that was put into place that became international law, and it also became the mentality of kind of a moral allowance for treating indigenous people from various parts of the world in terrible ways, enslavement and genocide and all of those things. So if you look at some of the roots to all of this, I think we do need to start peeling back the layers. And the reason why I'm saying this is that my point of view, my perspective in all of this is that the institutions that we consider normal to this day came out of turmoil and colonization of places like Europe and other parts of the world previous to what we have here. And those institutions, that way of thinking, that worldview was transported over here. And, even the capitalist way of thinking, came out of that survivalist, I'm going to hoard as much as I can because I went through starvation for generations. That kind of thinking, like, I think trauma-informed practice can help us recognize that there's roots to all of the way that our organization organizations are structured. Bureaucracy comes out of that because you're talking about control, that people that didn't have control developed a system where they were able to have control and collect as much as they could for themselves, because they went through a period of starvation and warfare and all of that. It's about survival. And I think a lot of our institutions come out of a survivalist mentality, but we've normalized that. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the values that drive those kinds of institutions, we say are the values that we should all espouse to in this world. So I think we have to go to that level to get to a place of thinking, do our institutions only need the influence of Indigenous people within those institutions? Or do we need to consider, are these institutions actually healthy for our world and for the people in this world? Or do we need to create something different that's not based, that doesn't have that kind of root of unresolved trauma and colonization? So I thank you for that question. I know it's a deep question, and my response, I think, was probably raises a lot more questions as well. But I think we have to get to that level of peeling back the layers to understand. So, what kind of impact can and should Indigenous people have on our institutions? Are we just trying to indigenize them, or are we trying to decolonize them? And I would like to think we have the opportunity, and I know a lot of people have been working on actually decolonizing our institutions.
Hmm. Yeah, that was. Thank you very much for that, Harley. And yeah, I want to echo your sentiments. It was a great question. I found your answer to be quite profound, and I think it gives us a lot of pause. It gives me pause to think about kind of how, about the ways in which we can move forward and why we do those things, and importantly, why things are, why our structures in society around institutions are the way that they are, and recognizing that trauma can be conceived as a root of a lot of that is deeply profound. Because I think a lot of the time, at least for me in my own, kind of speaking out here, I don't often view them as that. Let's just put it at that. So thank you very much, Harley. I have one last question, and I apologize to everybody. We won't be able to get to all the questions today. We really appreciated all of the engagement. It just goes to show how popular of a guy Harley is, and we'll be excited to bring him back at some point if he would care to join us again. But I have one question I think is a good one to end on. So James asks, if you were to imagine once this pandemic has passed, can you envision what you might hope could be considered a positive outcome for Indigenous peoples and relations with non-Indigenous healthcare providers? So I think I'm internalizing that question as, how can we use this experience? What would be the best possible outcome for us moving forward in this setting? What can this pandemic give to us? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a great question. Thank you, James, for that. I think if we can bring into consciousness the history that Indigenous people have with epidemics and its devastation, and everything that's meant to us over the centuries, and the current realities that things like the Indian Act and the reserve system. If we can see how that's connected to all of this and find those connections to this story that we all share in and that we all live in the milieu of it, and expose it, and find ourselves within that, whether you're a healthcare provider or another part of the system, I think it. And then even for us as Indigenous people, we don't often know this history as well. I didn't grow up learning this, right? I think some people have been lucky to been grown up within these kinds of teachings, but not a lot of us. I'd say a low percentage of us as Indigenous people. So if we can all become aware of this and find those connections, I think it'll change the nature of our relationships, to recognize, this. That's what cultural safety is about recognizing all of these connections and taking them into consideration in the moment that you're interacting with somebody in a doctor's office or in an emergency room. And that again takes practice. It takes it takes a journey to get to that place where you can actually interact in those culturally safe ways. But that's my hope, is that we can find the space, and maybe because we're physically distancing and isolating and sheltering in place, maybe we'll have the time to actually, read some books that are helpful on this, or talk with somebody that can share some of this, and we can take the time to, like I said at the beginning, to actually think about the feelings that we have in all of this, and to journal about it, to talk with others about it, um, and maybe it'll bring some awareness and all of these things into consciousness, where we begin to operate and in our relationships with this in mind, that it is in our consciousness, and I think that'll influence the way that we actually interact. That's my hope.
I think it's a great hope, and it brings up a really good point. Yeah, not a lot of us, kind of regardless of our background or where we come from, are really as educated as we would like to be about the histories of this country and of our own colonial history and our histories apart from that colonial aspect. And I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge my teachers, mentors, elders that have helped me on my way, on my journey, in learning more about this, and one of which I consider to be you, Harley. So thank you very much again for taking this time to join us. From a personal level, I always deeply appreciate our conversations. I come away feeling far more profound, having even just listened to what your thoughts are. So thank you again very, very much for joining us. I wanted to take a second to plug the remaining sessions for the Learning Circle for the coming month. Next week, we're going to have Jerry Ullman join us. Elder Jerry Ullman's going to come and talk to us about ceremony at a distance, how we can continue to practice and keep ourselves emotionally and spiritually well during this time. What does that look like? And then the week after that, Denise is going to join us for a conversation on gathering our medicine, which I'm really looking forward to. I think will be fantastic. And then into May, we'll have another session on, we'll have Melanie Rivers come and join us, and Leah Walker as well, to talk to us about generally about art therapy, which I think will be really helpful in this time. I know I myself would love to have some creative ideas to practice arts and be creative in my house. So I'm looking forward to that session as well. Again, thank you very much, Harley. Thank you everyone else for participating and joining us in Circle today. I had a really great time. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.